There's a lot that can go right when making an RPG. There's also a lot that can go wrong. In my last video, I discussed the things that need to go right to make an RPG, but it's also necessary to talk about the things that go wrong. It's much easier to learn from mistakes, they stand out more to us, so we often associate these things with quote unquote bad RPGs. But developers are working to change these stigmas RPGs have that deter players. When every genre is incorporating RPG elements and AAA RPGs all seem to follow the same stale template, it's up to us to discern the bad from the good for our fellow gamer. What really breaks an RPG and leads to many players putting down these games before reaching the conclusion are three main things: the combat systems in RPGs, the core game loop in RPGs, and the length of RPGs. I think what everyone immediately draws attention to when playing an RPG that they don't enjoy is that the combat is just not fun. Whether this be turn-based or real-time, melee or ranged, all RPGs have the capacity to make combat boring and unfun. It's important to break up the dense points of cutscenes and story with something, and most RPGs use combat to do this. It's also how the player usually fights the evil/wrong that they are attempting to thwart in the game, so it must feel appropriate to the theme. I mentioned that I think all RPGs can have poor combat systems, and that the form of combat doesn't necessarily contribute to a lack of satisfaction inherently. A trap I think many reviewers and players fall into is saying things like insert form of combat is boring or bad. What they actually mean to say is that games that they have played that use them lack depth, are too complex, or are a mixture of the two. Everyone has biases, and I think that this is okay, and we must acknowledge our own. We aren't going to like everything, but to generalize an aspect of games and consider it to be game ruining is unrealistic and close-minded. That is to say, all combat systems have the potential to be good, as long as they properly balance their complexity to their depth. There's no perfect ratio for this, but ideally a combat system will maximize the depth of every piece of it before adding complexity. A great example of this is the Soulsborne games from Software. Inherently, the combat mechanics are fairly simple, but there is so much depth to it that it is one of the greatest draws of the series and has inspired many similar systems and games. You can use the same basic moves across all weapons: light attack, heavy attack, running attack, rolling attack, and a jumping attack. This applies to every melee weapon in the game, and you can use all these moves at the cost of stamina. This same stamina is also used for evasive actions, requiring a careful balance of offense and defense. Finally, you have a certain amount of health, as do your enemies, and your goal is to deplete the enemy's health while maintaining yours. Many games share similar aspects, but what separates Dark Souls is the depth that these simple to use tools provide to you. There are classes of weapons which change how fast they are and how exactly they attack, adding many movesets the player can choose from for their playstyle or a certain situation. Your rolls have invincibility frames, which allow you to avoid damage from enemies, but only if you time them properly. Both of these things also use stamina, so you must balance whether you use your stamina for offense or defense. So much has to be managed and come together for the player to fight to their full potential, on top of there being many enemy types and patterns you must learn that the combat is always engaging. It is always better to add depth to your RPG before adding complexity to keep it accessible, but to also give it room to grow as the player progresses through the story. This keeps the combat from getting stale and the player feeling like they have mastered the combat well before they have reached the conclusion of the game. I got the idea of a core game loop from the principles of game design. In game design, there's an idea of a minimal viable product in which you strip your game down to minimum systems you need for it to function. Once you have this, you play and test it to see if it is fun to do repeatedly. This loop is ultimately what the player engages with the most in a game, and therefore very important that it does not get boring. This is especially important in long RPGs with grand stories that expect the player to make it to the end to tie up all the knots of their fulfilling story. More often than not, combat is a part of this core game loop and has a loop in itself. The core game loop is much larger than just the combat though. It involves a cycle of how the player may receive a task, be required to do combat, reach the conclusion of the task, receive a reward for the task, and use this reward to take on the next event. This cycle continues until they finish the loop, when they reach the conclusion of the main story itself and are rewarded with the conclusion to the game. Core loops apply to much more than just games. This video itself follows the same repeatable loop. I introduce an opinion or idea, explain said opinion or idea, provide examples of the opinion or idea, conclude my opinion or idea, and introduce a new opinion or idea. My goal is to keep you engaged until the end of the video so I can explain my opinions to you and receive your opinions in the comments. I make sure that I always introduce new ideas and examples to do this. For an example of a core game loop in a game, I'll use Skyrim, everyone's favorite. With combat systems, I use the Souls games as an example of a game that understands the important points of making a good combat system. I want to use Skyrim, however, to talk about a stale gameplay loop AAA Western RPGs, especially from Bethesda, have been using for well over a decade. In Skyrim, the core game loop is very simple. You receive a quest, go to an area where you must fight through enemies or solve puzzles until you find an enemy or item you're after. You kill them or take the item and return to the quest giver, receive gold or an item as payment, and start over again. This is a very simple core game loop that is used in plenty of games, and I think simplicity is good, but something so stale and simple isn't acceptable anymore. Games can't keep sending us players somewhere to kill or acquire an item mindlessly for a reward. In the beginning, players can take it, but when you're expected to pour hours into your huge game to explore all your quests and see all your cool set pieces, we need something a little more engaging than just this. I love Skyrim, and it is one of my favorite games, but the most memorable moments in the game are the moments that break from the usual gameplay loop I expect from the game and provide something more. Some may argue I enjoy these moments because of the fact that they exceed the status quo of the game, but I disagree. I think these moments stand out because they are legitimately interesting and should be the interesting moments that make up the game itself. The House of Horrors is a perfect quest that I'm sure all players who completed it remember. This quest is started when you are walking in Markarth and pass by Tyrannus, a priest who asks you to aid him in the search of an abandoned house he believes was once used to worship Daedra. You go inside with him, and when you make it to the basement, the doors lock behind you, and the Daedric prince Molag Bal orders you to kill Tyrannus. You kill Tyrannus, and Molag Bal invites you further into the basement to reward you. When you reach the reward, Molag Bal traps you in a cage and forces you to help him take revenge on another Daedric prince, Boethia, whose priest Logrulf has been desecrating its altar. You lure the priest back to the house, where Molag Bal traps him in the cage, and use Molag Bal's rusty mace to beat Logrulf into submission and kill him. Molag Bal rewards you for your aid with the Mace of Molag Bal. This quest is short, but is engaging and interesting all the way through. It is more than the core game loop of Skyrim while still providing an interesting story and worthy reward. This is just one way an RPG can incorporate something to create an interesting core game loop. South Park: The Stick of Truth is one of my favorite RPGs, and a big reason for that is its brevity. I beat the game in about 10 hours, which is on the very short side for an RPG, and for some people can be considered a single gaming session. This does wonders for the game, however, as there is no dull moment in it. South Park's humor is best when it's allowed to freely flow to the next joke and not be left lingering on any one thing. The developers understood this and took advantage of that. It has a small open world true to the show, the few side quests are varied and fulfilling, and the main plot is constantly in motion. It is a game that can be beaten in one sitting, and it is engaging enough to make you want to. It never overstays its welcome, and it's better for it. A game that is longer that I feel is better for it is Persona 5. In Persona 5, you have to manage your social links, your social stats, and various events throughout the game that if the player wants to experience even a fraction of it, they need time to explore and digest all of it. Persona 5 has a grand overarching story, but also personal stories with all the side characters you can explore. The excellent core game loop of balancing how to spend the different blocks of time in your day to accomplish goals and meet deadlines is fulfilling and engages the player all the way through. If the game ended too quickly, the player would feel like they were robbed of the satisfaction to tie up those loose ends. Because of this, the core game loop must be refined and engaging. Each game has what I consider a length ceiling, which is the point I reach in a game where if I have not completed it by that point, I am very likely to put it down and never play it again. Games must recognize this length ceiling and make sure not to exceed it to keep us playing. This is heavily dependent on the quality of the elements that comprise an RPG and how long they can hold our interest. Some games with grand stories that need time to develop don't have the combat and core game loops to keep us playing to the end. On the other hand, there are games that have deep combat systems and enjoyable loot, but have a story that develops too quickly and finishes before the player can reach the full potential of the combat, leaving players wanting more content. Length is a factor I don't think developers think of when making their RPGs, choosing instead to believe that longer is better because it gives room to provide more story. If the systems around your story can't sustain the length of your story, you need to either improve your systems or shorten your story. Thanks for watching this video. If you didn't watch the previous video I made, What Makes an RPG, I recommend you watch it so you have a better understanding of what I think an RPG is and why they are good. There should be a card in the top right, use that to take you to the video. I'd really like to hear what breaks RPGs for you, so feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll see you guys in the next one.